Okay, I want to welcome you all to the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series. My name is Colin Oriens, and I'm the Director of Environmental Studies. And this lecture series is made possible by the generosity of Tufts alumni Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke. And we're just so pleased to be able to bring today's speaker in this entire series to you. If you are at all interested in learning more about environmental programs at Tufts, we welcome you to attend a virtual environmental brunch on the 25th at 11 in the morning. And there you'll discover the possibilities. A lot of students, for example, have found internships through the various programs or other events that they want to attend. So the link is now in the chat. I also wanted to mention that the Environmental Studies program puts together a newsletter, and if you're a student, you can sign up. Again, the link is in the chat to receive the newsletter. And we also, if you want to learn more about the series for this fall, for the Hoke Cunningham series, we are putting that in the chat as well. So before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to do a little sort of housekeeping. The chat is disactivated. So we encourage you to put any questions that you might have in the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of his talk, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Dr. Agyeman has said that he'd be more than welcome to follow up with any of you by email if you have further questions. So without any, oh, and lastly, I wanted to mention that the meeting will be recorded. So if you want to go back and see something in particular or refer to a friend or a colleague, you can go to the Environmental Studies website and find the recording. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague here at Tufts, Dr. Julian Agyeman. We've known each other for quite some time. He's a prolific scholar and activist, making us think about how to make our cities more equitable, just, environmental friendly, and welcoming. He was born in the UK, and he did his bachelor's in geography and botany, and a master's in conservation policy and a doctorate in urban studies at the University of London. And he came to Tufts in the early 2000s. I mentioned he's incredibly prolific, and he's a leading scholar in the area of just sustainabilities, the topic of his talk today. He's edited 12 different books, and he even co-authored one book with an undergraduate student, Sydney Giacoloni, who graduated a few years ago. To illustrate his global reach, his book on just sustainabilities has been cited over 1,000 times, and he has given hundreds of invited seminars on the topic. One article that he published, Mind the Gap, has been cited over 6,589 times. What an achievement. Wow. I am so thankful that you have agreed to come and present to our community, Julian, which, by the way, includes people from all over the world. Julian, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Colin. Thank you, Sarah, for organizing this and for inviting me to the honor of the inaugural lecture for this semester. Being a bookseller, I couldn't get away without showing you the book that if you were to try and find something that encompassed all of my thinking, this is probably the book that I would recommend. This is Introducing Just Sustainabilities Policy Planning and Practice through Z Books. And really all the ideas that I'm going to touch on are dealt with in this book. I want to start with a land recognition. I'm increasingly aware that when we talk about difference and diversity in cities, we often forget the indigenous sovereignty of the land on which we are based. And at Tufts University, we are based on a mixture of Wampanoag and Massachusetts land, and I want to pay my respects to the elders, to the past, present and future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as a part of this meeting. Let me give you a little bit about the history of Just Sustainabilities. It's now about 18 years since we published the first book called Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World. We published it because what we noticed was all of the discourse, all of the practice, all of the academic writing on sustainability and sustainable development was always about environmental sustainability. And if we went out onto the streets of your city today and asked 10 people what sustainability is, 9 or even 10 would say it's about the environment, and of course it is. But unless we have a socially just society, can we really say that it is sustainable? And so this was the first book to not feature one chapter on equity and justice, as many books did and still do, but the whole book was about how do equity and justice, how do environmental quality and human equality interrelate. And we came out with not a definition, but a point that sustainability cannot simply be a green or environmental concern, important though the environmental aspects of sustainability are. A truly sustainable society, we argued, is one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to environmental limits. So we weren't saying it's about social justice, we were saying it's about social justice and living within limits. And it's interesting, I've been teaching my Just Sustainabilities class for 20 years now, and I keep getting emails from students over these last few months saying, oh my God, what you were saying about how equity and justice and environmental sustainability, what you were saying is so important now. And I think really this is the time to really take Just Sustainabilities seriously. Now, if we weren't looking at equity and justice and environmental sustainability together, this book, and I don't usually as an academic advertise other people's books, but this book really brought the two together. There was a really important point in the book, which is basically about why equality is better for everyone. And the book really is looking at the link between environmental quality and social equality. And they found that in societies where there was the income gap or the wealth gap was the lowest, there was less social malaise, there was less teen pregnancies, less violence, less domestic violence. On every parameter, over 40 years of data around the world, the argument was that basically the bigger the wealth gap, the more social malaise that there was. And another point that they made was that the most unequal societies have the highest level of consumption. And they called it competitive consumption, keeping up with the Joneses. Now, the point here, I think that's really important, is they then go on to say that competitive consumption fuels our carbon footprint. They make the link between inequality and climate change, that societies that are the most unequal generally have higher carbon footprints. So if we really want to understand sustainability, our focus should be on both human equality and environmental quality together. But 20 years ago, when we were first thinking about this, you had the environmental groups that were doing their thing, and then you had like Amnesty International and the social justice groups. They weren't talking to each other. We need human equality and environmental quality to come together to begin to think about these things. Let me give you one example. For those of you that are old enough, you might remember in the 1980s, Chico Mendes was killed in the Amazon rainforest. Chico Mendes was hailed by environmental groups as a green campaigner. But actually, he was president of the Brazilian Rubber Tappers Union. He was a social justice activist. But he understood that the protection of the rainforest and people's livelihoods were commingled. You can't separate out the rainforest health from people's livelihoods. And so he understood that. The same happened in Nigeria with Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed, I'm not going to say who by, but he was killed. He was a campaigner against the flaring of oil drilling in the Niger Delta. And he understood the links between the health of the Niger Delta and people's livelihoods. Again, these two campaigners from the global south understood the links between environmental quality and human equality. We need to stop being so reductionist in the global north and think about success of sustainability campaigns as being about human equality and environmental quality together. I would argue the reason why we've failed on social justice and the reason why we've failed on environmental protection is we've separated them out. They are not separate. Let me define just sustainabilities. We came up with a definition: the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And so there are 4 conditions. Quality of life and well-being must be improved around the world. We must commit to meeting the needs of both present and future generations. That's intra and intergenerational equity. We must ensure justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Now, let me just stop there because there's a very important point here. A lot of the environmental justice thinking has been, let's get the process and procedure right. Let's get people access to justice over unfairness. But there's another principle, a legal principle that comes before that. And this is the principle of recognition. Black Lives Matter is the current greatest cry for recognition. It's saying, I exist, respect my right to exist. Indigenous cries for recognition. Me Too, women's and not just women's, but all sexualities' rights to practice their sexualities in ways that they see fit. This idea of recognition, how can we ever reconcile if we don't recognize? And then the final, again, living within ecosystem limits. The point here is we accept, in just sustainability's terms, we need to do all of these 3 conditions within the limits of ecosystems, so-called one planet living. Now, being in urban planning, I want to really give you a couple of thoughts that I'm going to touch on as we go through this talk. One of the most convincing definitions that I feel has come out on urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. That's what urban planning is. How do we manage and how do we coexist in shared space? And Leonie Sandercock at UBC takes this further. She says, this speaks with equal clarity about environmental, transport, housing and other conflicts, reminding us that whether we like it or not, we share space on the planet with others who in many ways are not like us. And we need to find ways of coexisting in space, you know, from the neighborhood, the street, the city, the region, and eventually the whole globe. Urban planning would be easy if every single person was the same. But our cities are increasingly diverse and different. How do we manage coexistence across difference and diversity? How do we manage in an intercultural way? And then the second point I want to bring up is the relationship between belonging and becoming. So as urban planners, we're visionaries. We're always thinking, what can the city become? It can become smart, sharing, resilient, sustainable. But what we're not as good at is who gets to belong? How do we recognize belonging? How do we think about reconciliation, difference, diversity, and inclusion? And Just Sustainabilities aims to balance our attention to these 2 key facets. We mustn't stop dreaming about what we can become. We mustn't do that. Vision is important. But what we must also do is recognize that what the city can become will only be as good as who can belong in the city. And finally, I just want to say as well, Just Sustainabilities and urban planning, often urban planning talks about human scaled planning. And I get that. We want to plan cities for the human scale. But I think, as I'm going to show you, we need to add an E. I think we need humane scaled. We need empathetic planning. We need planning with dignity, planning that recognizes that we don't all start from the same place, and we don't all look alike, and we don't all have the same set of values. So I'm going to give 3 examples for the rest of my talk. I'm going to talk about spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? I'm going to go real contemporary and talk about Minneapolis. How does one of the most green and liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And then I'm going to finish up by talking about food justice. And I'm going to provoke you, as I provoke my food justice class this semester, what is local food in an intercultural society? What do we mean by local? So let me start. Many cities have walls. This is Jerusalem, Nicosia, Belfast used to have a wall, but many US cities don't need walls. There's a freeway, there's a creek, there's a railway. On one side, you live, and on the other side, they live. We live in spatially unjust communities, and fortunately we have one of the most powerful tools that geography has given since the map, which is GIS, to show how spatial injustice plays out in our cities. And, you know, we're sitting in the Boston area here, many of us, you know, Brookline and Roxbury, they're only a few miles apart, yet life chances, life expectancy, everything about your life is different if you're born in Brookline or you're born in Roxbury. How do we think about and develop more spatially just communities? And I want to bring this as an urban planner, I want to bring it down to the street. 2 streets. On the left, you have Södervägen in Gothenburg, and on the right, you have Massachusetts Avenue, looking down from Porter Square to Harvard Square. They couldn't be more different. On the right, we have a principle of might is right. The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have to space. That's the American way. And this is Cambridge, Massachusetts, perhaps the most liberal city in the US. On the left, what the Swedes have done is imposed spatial justice on the street. They're the same width, and if you see the streetcar, to the left of the streetcar is the only bit of the street that is available for private vehicles. 80% of the streetscape in Södervägen is for active transportation, walking and cycling, or for public transit, the streetcars. This is what I call democratization of the streets. The Swedes have done a great job at it. We're starting to think about it more and more in the US, and that's a good thing. This picture from Mass Ave was taken quite a long time ago. There is now at least a bike lane, a protected bike lane going down the center of the avenue. Why is this important? Well, it's important for several reasons. I think to myself, and there's a great PhD project here, what does the kid growing up in either of these 2 streets, how are they wired differently? The kid in Sweden comes out into a street with order, democracy. The kid coming out onto Mass Ave, well, you take your life in your own hands, basically. And you can see some cars there trying to get across, and it's a mess. Whereas the Swedes have imposed a democratic notion onto the street. And we have some data on this. Don Appleyard did some work in the early 80s, and he found that basically social interactions on streets are much less in heavily trafficked streets than lightly trafficked streets. What's the just sustainabilities angle here? Who lives in neighborhoods with more heavily trafficked streets? Low income minorities. So we can see that spatial justice is very important in thinking about streets and the traffic volumes. And the lightly trafficked streets are, you know, the complete streets. They are the ones where there's traffic calming, and they're usually in the more tony neighborhoods. Good news from New York. I don't agree with everything Mayor Bloomberg did, but one great thing he did was hire Janet Sadiq Khan as his transportation commissioner. She brought in Jan Gale, who was the mastermind of Copenhagen's 50-year miracle. This is what we have today in New York. These are people streets. These are streets for people. But it illustrates a point I want you to really think about, a really, really important point. Urban planning should be about what is possible, not what is probable. If we do what we've probably always done, we won't get out of this rut. We have to dream about what we can become, and we have to think about what is possible. We can change our streets, and this is what they can look like. But we're all very good as urban designers, architects, at saying you don't belong. And we can use what's called hostile or defensive architecture. Great examples here on the top left. Those studs stop teenage kids skateboarding. The multicolored bench stops homeless people sleeping by putting armrests there. Even more horrific are the studs that some architects put to stop homeless people sleeping. We do this to stop pigeons on ledges. We put spikes. How abhorrent is it that we do that to human beings? On the bottom right, some cities, well, a lot of cities require developers to put a certain amount of affordable housing into developments. Some developers have gone even further and put the door for the poor people in the back alley and the rich door on the boulevard. This is unconscionable in the 21st century. And on the bottom left is a picture from Seattle where there was a homeless problem, people living under the bridge. So the city thought, we know what we can do. Let's put bike racks there. Let's use sustainability infrastructure to deter homeless people. Thankfully, the biking community in Seattle said, whoa, no. Seattle, we have a problem with homelessness. It requires policy solutions. Do not use bike infrastructure to try and deter homeless people. So these are just some examples of how we can deny belonging in cities through urban design and architecture. Now, one very interesting idea from my friend Elijah Anderson at Yale, sociologist, is the concept of the cosmopolitan canopy. Basically, Elijah's point is, what we all do is we go down the streets every day trying to ignore each other, but there are certain places called cosmopolitan canopies where we sit down, we watch some TV, and his example here is the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. We sit down, we watch TV, and we chat civilly to each other. How do we, as urban planners, create cosmopolitan canopies? How do we create spaces of engagement? How do we create spaces like this where people sit and chat across difference? Food, children, and dogs, three great things that I think are useful. Dog parks, water fountains for kids, and food spaces. Think about that. How do we create more cosmopolitan canopies where we can establish contact? And for those of you who are sociologists, contact theory says the more contact you have across difference, the more tolerant you are, the more inviting you are of policies that bring people together. Another solution to spatial injustice might be this idea of complete streets. And I've given you some examples here from Massachusetts and on the right from Toronto. Complete streets is a discourse, it's a movement, it's a design approach to reversing car-centric planning. On the left, you have a street in Athens. On the right, you have a design. How do we create streets like the street on the left? Because streets are not conduits for cars. Streets are places. And as Doreen Massey, the late great geographer, said, they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Streets are social ecologies. The problem is most urban designers don't seem to understand that. And so they design cookie cutter designs to slot people in. What we have to have is urban designers who are more socio-ecologically inclined. LA, believe it or not, has a complete streets policy, but until very recently, it banned street traders. In LA, Latinx and South Asian cultures live on the streets. Street food is part of their culture. How do we call them complete streets if we deny the cultural rights of people, immigrants especially, to do what they do? Fortunately, LA reversed the policy fairly recently. One of the dangers, though, of this complete streets, of making these ecological or sustainable streets, is gentrification and greenlining. Redlining was a very much a racist way of denying funding in lower income minority neighborhoods. Greenlining is not racist. Greenlining and greening of neighborhoods is not racist, but the neighborhoods look very much like redlined neighborhoods, or they look like exclusive neighborhoods in the sense that who can afford to live in those expensive neighborhoods? So one of the dangers of the complete streets movement is perhaps we're systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US cities for the last century or so. And let me give you an example. So walkability is the key metric for sustainable neighborhoods. How walkable is your neighborhood? And there's an app for that, because there's an app for everything these days. Who owns the app for WalkScore? It's Redfin, the realty company. Let's just pause for a moment and think about this. We have commodified sustainability such that a realty company owns the app for the key metric of urban sustainability. Let that sink in for a moment. How do we decouple the very reasonable idea of complete streets from rental and price rises and ultimately gentrification? It's a work ongoing across urban planning. There are no quick answers to that. We can think of urban parks as well in terms of spatial justice. This book by, again, a friend of mine, Setha Lowe, is Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. Her point is, in this new century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not one of disuse, but of patterns of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. One thing I'm thinking about a lot more is, how do we co-design, co-manage, and co-program parks? How do we use a co-production approach to parks? Wouldn't parks work much better if communities co-designed, co-managed, and co-programmed parks? And again, it brings in this idea of what are public spaces? I want to see public spaces as spaces where people meet across difference, where people don't sit just in their social groups, that they are spaces where we can engage across difference. In Boston, there's an excellent article from 2004 by Lanford and Taylor about how do we engage immigrants in public open space. And the point is that most of the organizations, the Friends of Park X or Y, most of these organizations are very much white middle class. And yet Boston is now a majority minority city. What is the future of our cherished Olmstedian open spaces as we become more diverse and as immigrants are not represented on the management boards of these parks? And this paper is available, and I can give you a copy. It is a fabulous read, and it was visionary in its time, 2004. One thing we've noticed, though, that's really, I think, very important is this idea of landscape links. A Guatemalan American said, I think one of the reasons that that place, Herta Park, is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park because it looks like home. People gravitate to familiar landscapes. This is why I call this landscape links. In Copenhagen, and you might think Copenhagen is a white Danish, tall, beautiful people city. It's not. It's a very diverse city, and the Nørrebro district is super diverse. And there's a park called Superkilen Park, where urban designers tried to design in encounter by putting artifacts from different countries represented by the people who lived in the neighborhoods. It's a great idea. It's a start to try and make place around people's cultures. I think we need to move towards deep ethnographies, certainly as urban planners. What we tend to do is look at demographic data and say, oh, there's X%, this culture, this culture. We need to go deeper. Deep ethnographies say, what are the cultural proclivities? What are the daily practices of these groups? And there's a great paper in the journal that I edit, and again, I can give you copies of this, Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. How do we use the anthropological concept of ethnography in urban design and urban planning? It's a really important point. And there's a group at University of Sheffield in the UK called the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group, who are doing some really excellent work on refugees in parks, significance of benches, wonderful, wonderful anthropologically theorized work brought into urban planning and design. Let me go on to Minneapolis. Is Minneapolis a green utopia? It's one of the best cities in the US to live in for exercise, the best park system, most bike commuters. It's a miracle city in many ways, as is Portland. But underneath, Minneapolis has some of the highest levels of racial inequality, the highest income gap, black-white income gap, the achievement or opportunity gap, K through 12, is massive. The home ownership gap or the wealth gap is massive. So this, I think, illustrates my concept of just sustainabilities. On many levels, you and I, Colin, Sarah, would say, oh, Portland, it's a green mecca. Minneapolis, it's a green mecca. But underneath, if we look at urban planning and what urban planning has done to the city, it's a racist hell. Why is this? All that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about the city, says Kirsten Delegard. Why? Racialized covenants. Covenants that said this house must not be sold, rented, or otherwise to anybody other than the Caucasian race. And then it detailed everybody from horrific language, Negroes, Mongoloids, Orientals. I mean, horrific, horrific, horrific language. And these existed till the 1960s. The city had until very recently single family zoning, 70% of the land. The parks were racially cordoned by single family zoning to keep undesirables out of the parks. We had redlining. What's the result? Racial segregation then and now. And the former director of long-range planning said there's a direct link between those practices in the late 19th and early 20th century and today's modern zoning plans. And part of the impetus for change is the way, is to try and undo those impacts, to dismantle white supremacy in a sense. My simple point is urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. And Minneapolis is, through the Minneapolis 2040 plan. Their goal number 1 is to eliminate disparities. Goal number 3, affordable and accessible housing. The city changed. The city was the first major city to change the single family zoning ordinance to allow duplexes and triplexes, as well as inclusionary zoning, requiring new apartment projects to include at least 10% of units for low to moderate income families. Third, and I'm aware of the time here, cultivating food justice, race, class, and sustainability. Again, it's another book opportunity here. If you're interested in food justice, this book from 2011 was really one of the first to link race, class, and sustainability to food. So I want to talk a little bit about food and just sustainabilities. So let me start with that provocation I gave you at the beginning. What are local foods in intercultural societies? Bottom right corner, you've got the now sadly late George and his wife Julia Bowling. They're tobacco farmers in Maryland. They are being encouraged by the states to get out of tobacco and to diversify. George and Julia, being good American entrepreneurs, they see that just across the border in DC, there are 120,000 Africans, many of whom are middle and upper middle class, doctors, diplomats, lawyers, surgeons. And so they said, why don't we start growing African food? The African community doesn't want their food flown in or frozen, they want fresh food. So they grow African produce, and that's the signboard to their farm. The University of Maryland Extension developed a research project to see what popular African food crops will grow in the Maryland climate. So what are local foods in an intercultural society? If you talk to a lot of ecologists, they'll tell you that, oh, this is what local food is in Massachusetts. But many different cultures in the US want culturally appropriate foods that are grown in the US. Now, the word local is interesting. As a geographer, I can tell you that it has no meaning. It only has meaning when somebody applies meaning to it. There is no definition of local. 50 miles, 100 miles, 10 miles, there's no definition. Maybe local is not a geographic concept, but a more cultural concept. And if we look at the Filipinos in San Diego, when asked what is local food, they said it's their food, the food that they eat in their restaurants, or the food that they grow in their yards. So I want to introduce you here to an idea of translocalism. Perhaps people from different cultures that have immigrated to the US bring with them their own local. Just as the Guatemalans want to be by the willows on the banks of the River Charles, maybe Filipinos and Africans want their food grown locally. We need more reflexivity in our understanding of what local is. And I think in doing that, we would build a bigger movement for local food than the largely sort of white middle and upper middle class grouping that are fetishizing the local at present. Let's take a trip across the border to Canada. 20% of farmers in the greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And interestingly, they don't use the farmers markets, the largely white farmers markets. They've created their own network of roadside markets. Now, again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I gave this talk in Vancouver, and a Kenyan woman who'd just come from Kenya said, "Oh, Julian, I always go to the Chinese markets, Chinese food markets, because they grow the food that I want." We have to accept that there are very different interpretations of local, translocal, and maybe we have to live with that and be less prescriptive within the very vocal alternative food movement. This story always makes me, it gives me, you know, a feeling of warmth, but of sadness as well. This is this picture is from the former South Central Farm in LA. It was the biggest urban farm in the United States, 90% Latinx people, and the sentiment here, I think, is beautiful. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We have the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. So if you look at that garden, it's not just about culturally appropriate foods. It's about creating a space. It's about autotopography, inscribing your culture and identity onto the urban landscape through food, autotopography. And this is from a chapter in my book, Cultivating Food Justice. But it's a fascinating idea. But it speaks again to that umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now, to belonging and becoming. Tufts is part of a network of 50 community farms dedicated to refugee agriculture, newcomer agriculture, through our, I always forget the name of it, New Entry Farm. New Entry Farm, New Roots Farm in San Diego here. These are farms where newcomers can get a first footing into agriculture in the United States. And it's just the same as the Scandinavians did in the plains a couple of hundred years ago. But these new immigrants are more likely to be farming in urban areas: New York, Burlington, Lowell, Minneapolis, Phoenix, San Diego. So these are the new agriculturalists in many ways, doing the job that their forebearers did a couple of hundred years ago. And I'm going to finish with another shameless plug for my latest book, this is the book that I did with the undergraduate Sydney Giacalone, who's now a PhD student at Brown, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labour and Identity in North America. The book really is about the fact that we can't talk about immigration policy without food, without talking about food policy. Up to 70% of workers in the food chain are undocumented immigrants. But we also can't talk about immigrants and food without thinking about the daily practices around food procurement that immigrants go through. And our argument is that as we become more xenophobic as a country and more anti-immigrant, food becomes, again, that umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now, a source of comfort, a source of pride, and a source of sustenance. So let me summarize as follows. We need to think about how we manage our coexistence in shared space. We need to think about fostering both belonging and becoming. We need to think about deepening our engagement and understanding of communities through deep ethnographies. We need to engage in intercultural, culturally competent, or culturally humble planning and policy making. My students and I have this debate: should we say cultural competency or cultural humility? And I think I'm erring on the side of cultural humility. We need to practice humane scaled and human scaled urban planning and design. And I want to leave you with a final point. Social justice never simply happens in planning processes and outcomes. It must be intentional, implicit, and front and center in our work. There has never been a policy designed around economic efficiency and environmental quality that has had as a byproduct, a desirable byproduct, increased social justice. We have to start with social justice and equity in developing our policies and plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. That was wonderful. And we do have some questions from the audience. And the first question comes from Barbara Papalau, who's asking about zoning laws. Can they be used to sort of inhibit overbuilding on lots so there are corridors where people are given shade, benches, places to gather in neighborhoods? So it's really a question about, is there a way to zone requirements for larger setbacks and green areas that about sidewalks and larger common areas that sort of get at some of the points you were addressing?
In short, yes. I mean, I don't.
Keep going.
Oh, yeah. I'm no great expert on zoning. I've only looked at really zoning in the sense of its use historically as a tool of segregation. But there are, I understand, many different ways, form-based zoning, ways to change zoning such that it enables what we want rather than what we don't want. So absolutely, and I'm happy to hear that Michelle Wu is declaring her candidacy for mayor of Boston, and she's explicitly said that she's going to she's going to do many things, but in terms of planning and zoning, she's going to reform the Boston Planning and Development Authority, which largely has been seen as an arm of the mayor, and she's going to reform zoning such that communities have much more input. So I would expect, if we do get some, big zoning reform in Boston, that this is humane, that this is human scaled, that this allows communities to have much more say in what happens in their neighborhoods.
Thank you very much. You mentioned Michelle Wu, and that brings us to the next question, which is, as UEP has been training many planners, urban planners, and you've seen maybe changes in the dynamics of urban planners, both locally and across the country. What percentage of urban planners are from Black, Latino, Asians, some of the minority communities that you mentioned? And what is UEP doing to promote and prepare practitioners of color?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And again, I usually take about 50 to 55 minutes with this talk. So I've missed out a couple of things. One really important point I missed out, and I can answer it right now. And let me start it with a question. If your organization, whether it's a non-profit, whether it's a political party, whether it's a planning department, if your organization doesn't look like the community it serves, are you legitimate? Are you trusted? Are you effective? Can you even do what your mission says you should be doing? We need desperately more representation. I mean, basically, planning departments should look like America, just like political parties should look like America, but they don't. So at the very least, what we could, what we might ask for would be something along the lines of a culturally competent or culturally humble planning department, where, you know, through the use of ethnography, co-produced with local communities, people produce these ethnographic data about the communities in which they live. We are the most diverse urban planning department, certainly in terms of women. Over 50% of our department is female, and we are up in the top 5 in terms of racial and ethnic diversity in terms of faculty. Does that reflect in our student body? No, it doesn't. You know why? Because Tufts is very, very expensive. And so we try to have a very diverse planning group, but it doesn't always work that way. It's not that we don't get any diversity, but we want more diversity. We want more people going into urban planning. But to the questioner, you know, my question, does your organization look like the community it's serving? And if it doesn't, we need to change that, and it really needs to change quickly.
Thank you very much. And I think there's a question about sort of permanent structures. Traffic in Boston is a huge concern. The role of permanent spaces like highways cutting through segregating neighborhoods. Have there been some sort of creative ways in which people have taken these barriers that you talked about at the beginning, highways, and broken down some of the injustices associated with across the tracks?
Well, you know, so there's an interesting thing. I mean, I live on Brookline Street, which goes from BU Bridge to the Middle East on Massachusetts Avenue. Had there not been highway revolts in the 70s, there would have been a freeway now going right outside the front of my house. And what was really interesting across the country, one really good example of intercultural social movement building and campaigning was groups coming together to fight freeways, to fight the injustice of freeways going and busting up neighborhoods. There are groups in Roxbury like ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment, that have really focused on, you know, not on anti-car, but on pro-public transport planning. And one of the big campaigns they ran was against the Silver Line. The community was promised a fixed rail system, but they got the Silver Line. So the campaign was the Silver Lie. They just took the N out. So probably environmental justice groups have been more active, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, on pro-public transit and roads issues than almost any other environmental justice kind of issues. So yes, activism around street design, as I was talking about it, activism around that, and activism around gentrification, because when those cool, complete streets come into your low-income neighborhood, you know what's going to happen. You know that rents are going to go up. You know that house prices are going to go up. You know that, well, there was a piece recently about Portland, and how, you know, I mean, people think of Portland as a white city. It had a large African-American community. And through gentrification, that has largely been changed. And so the irony is now, on the lawns of the homes that used to be owned by black folks, there are Black Lives Matter signs by the new white residents of these areas. So I think there's a link between transportation, roads, complete streets, gentrification, and anti-racism. And, you know, dare I use that word, intersectionality? There is no silver bullet campaigning technique in this. We have to see these as intersecting aspects of structural racism.
Our work, we have lots of work to do. It gets to one more question here that's sort of related to this, which is that one of the complaints about these complete streets is that it has created real traffic backup and problems for commuters. And maybe a little less so right now in times of COVID, where the streets are more empty. But how do you respond to people who oppose complete streets because of traffic jams?
Okay, so the dominant, these are great questions. The dominant paradigm in transportation planning in the US, I mean, there are pockets of good practice, but is what's called traffic management. Okay, Boston has, what, 5-6 years ago, or I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, but Mayor Walsh teamed up with Google through the Waze app to help move traffic around Boston more effectively. That's called traffic management. It says, let's move traffic more efficiently. And you might think that's great. We need to shift to a paradigm of traffic reduction. That's a whole different way of thinking. And once it's like waste management or waste reduction. If you think of waste management, you're thinking about how do we manage the waste that we've got, rather than how do we reduce it. Traffic management, traffic reduction. How do we shift transportation planning paradigm into one of traffic reduction? Because I understand the questioner's points. And yes, some NIMBY neighborhoods, you know, want complete streets to slow down the traffic, to, you know, to make their neighborhood nice, and it merely causes backlogs in the rest of the city. So traffic reduction strategies should be citywide, not on an area basis. You can't just kick motorists out of cars. You've got to provide viable alternatives. So this is where integrated transport planning comes in. You know, we need, and we're doing quite a lot of it in the Boston metro area with protected bike lanes, enhanced walking environments, but we've got a clunky old public transit system that just needs to be changed. And all you need to do is to go to cities like Copenhagen or Stockholm, where, you know, you can stand on the platform, the train comes in and you hardly even notice because they just swoosh in and out. They don't clank and screech. So the first, I think one of the first jobs we have to do is change the transportation psychology. You know, buses aren't just for low-income people. Go to London and you see all social groups. Go to Amsterdam or Copenhagen and you see all social groups on bikes. You know, women with hijab, pregnant women, elderly people. We in the US have made transportation a very fashion-conscious thing, and so we need to change that. So I know this is a long way round way of talking about what the questioner asked, but these are all the things we need to think about, and our traffic planning needs to shift towards a balanced traffic reduction strategy.
Great response. I'm going to end with one last question from the chat. and this relates to Black Lives Matter. And there's been a lot of attention about policing and defunding policing. This might be a little bit out of your sort of expertise.
Well, I'm sure I'll have an opinion, Colin.
So part of the recent conversations about reforming police has been on proving alternatives to formal policing. How can urban cityscape design reduce the need for policing?
Great question. Okay, so you use two words, defund and reform. I prefer the word reform. The word defund was used politically to say that basically Democrats, wanted anarchy on the streets. Nobody was talking about defunding, reallocating resources. And funnily enough, I was just on a call before this, and we were talking about precisely this issue. So why would, well, put it this way, I wouldn't call the police if there was a drunk person outside my house doing something. And I doubly wouldn't call the police if that person was black. There needs to be community, not community policing, we've had that, but there needs to be a more socially community-oriented group of people that can intervene in situations that do not require armed response. I mean, yes, sadly in this nation, we require armed response in certain situations, but I could see us co-producing community safety, co-producing. I mean, there's a whole nother lecture on this notion of co-production. Let me give you an example of co-production. If you are if you are discharged from Lehigh Regional Medical Center in Pennsylvania, having had one of a certain number of procedures, you won't be followed up by a doctor or a nurse. You'll be followed up by somebody who has had the same procedure. The recovery rates are immeasurably higher if you're followed up by somebody who can empathize with you. That's the problem. We're putting young kids, young police officers on the streets who can't necessarily empathize. And to the point that I made about does your organization, does your police force look like the community? 94% of Minneapolis police officers were from the suburbs. How do they empathize with what's going on given the segregated background that I mentioned? We need to co-produce community security and community peace. And that can only come by really, saving the police for armed response and certain situations. But there are other situations where we could envisage there being a much lower key, empathetic, community-based response. So this is not about defunding or anarchy. This is about increasing community security, increasing community peace through a co-production effort.
Well, Julian, thank you so much. And audience, thank you for some really stimulating questions. I really appreciated your presentation and the question and answer session, and look forward to seeing you virtually again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.